Somewhere on the walls of Constantinople, a soldier is watching an army pour through a breach they were never supposed to reach. These men carry crosses on their shields. They swore an oath in front of a pope. They are, on paper, the good guys of medieval Christendom, sent out to save the Holy Land. And right now, none of that matters, because they are 3 days into burning down the largest, richest, most spectacular city in the entire Christian world, and Jerusalem is over 1,000 miles away, completely untouched. This is the Fourth Crusade. It is, by nearly every metric, the worst-run holy war in history. And the wild part is that nobody involved set out to make it happen this way. It just kept happening, one reasonable decision at a time, until an army meant to liberate a city ended up demolishing one instead. To understand how a crusade goes this catastrophically off course, you have to go back 6 years, to a new pope with old ambitions. Innocent III took office in 1198 and inherited an uncomfortable fact. Jerusalem had fallen back into Muslim hands. The last crusade had failed to take it back, and Europe's nobility, once again, needed convincing to drop everything and go fight for it. The call went out. Knights and nobles across France signed on, pledging men and money for an expedition that, on paper, had one job: get to the Holy Land, retake Jerusalem. Simple enough. Nobody, however, had worked out how thousands of men and their horses were actually supposed to cross the Mediterranean. Overland routes had a habit of getting crusades slaughtered before they arrived. So the leadership did the sensible thing and turned to the one power in Europe with the ships to move an army that size: Venice. The deal was straightforward on paper and enormous in practice. Venice would build an entire purpose-made fleet, enough to carry 33,500 men, their horses, and a year's worth of supplies. In exchange, the Crusaders would pay a fortune up front, plus a cut of anything they conquered along the way. Venice took the deal seriously. They paused huge parts of their economy for over a year building ships to spec. Then, in the summer of 1202, the Crusaders actually showed up to leave, and barely a third of the promised army was standing on the docks. Some knights had changed their minds. Others sailed from different ports entirely, deciding Venice's price wasn't worth it. Whatever the reason, what arrived was a fraction of the force Venice had built an entire navy around, which meant a fraction of the payment too. The Crusaders owed a fortune they didn't have, for a fleet they couldn't use without Venice's cooperation, stranded on what was functionally an island they had no way of leaving. Venice, understandably, was not in a forgiving mood. The Doge of Venice, an elderly statesman named Enrico Dandolo, had a solution. There was a city called Zara, on the Adriatic coast, that had defected from Venetian rule and put itself under the protection of the King of Hungary. If the Crusaders helped Venice take it back, Venice would defer the debt. Simple, efficient, and completely insane, because Zara was a Catholic city, ruled by a Catholic king, and attacking fellow Christians was the one thing a crusade was explicitly, absolutely not supposed to do. The Pope found out and forbade it, on pain of excommunication. The Crusaders attacked Zara anyway. In November 1202, the army raised to fight for Christendom sacked a Christian city to settle a shipping invoice. The Pope excommunicated the entire expedition, then, after some frantic groveling, quietly unexcommunicated the Crusaders while leaving Venice out in the cold, a distinction Venice appeared entirely unbothered by. The crusade limped into winter camp at Zara, already 2 years behind schedule, already 0 for 1 on holy missions accomplished, and about to get worse. Because that winter, a fugitive Byzantine prince named Alexios Angelos came looking for them with an offer nobody in his position should have been able to make, and nobody in the Crusaders' position should have believed. Alexios's father, Emperor Isaac II, had been overthrown, blinded, and thrown in prison by his own brother, in one of Byzantium's periodic family disputes over who got to sit on the throne. Alexios had spent years bouncing between European courts looking for muscle to put his father back in power. In the stranded, debt-crushed Fourth Crusade, he finally found an army desperate enough to listen. His pitch was almost suspiciously generous. Help him overthrow his uncle, restore his father, and he would personally pay off the entire Venice debt, fund troops for the actual crusade to Jerusalem, and reunite the Eastern Church under the authority of Rome, healing a century-and-a-half-old religious split in one move. All he needed was for the Crusaders to sail to Constantinople and put him on the throne. The leadership said yes. A lot of the ordinary soldiers were less than thrilled. Having now been rerouted twice from the enemy, they'd actually signed up to fight. But debts make decisions for people, and by the summer of 1203 the fleet was sailing up to the walls of the largest, most fortified city on earth. The sitting usurper fled the moment he realized which way the wind was blowing. The Crusaders installed Alexios's father back on the throne, crowned young Alexios as co-emperor, and considered the job done. Debt solved. Mission back on track. Except the treasury was nowhere near as full as Alexios had promised, and paying off a foreign army meant taxing an already exhausted population and melting down church treasures to cover the difference. Within months, Alexios IV had gone from liberated heir to deeply resented puppet, propped up by an army camped uncomfortably close to the capital's walls. By early 1204, a palace official with famously heavy eyebrows, nicknamed Mort Sufflos, staged a coup, had Alexios strangled in his cell, and crowned himself emperor instead. And just like that, the Crusaders' debtor was dead, their payment was gone, and an entire army was parked outside Constantinople with nothing to show for 2 years of detours. At this point, the leadership stopped pretending there was a diplomatic solution. There was no more talk of restoring rightful emperors or reunifying churches. The plan was simple: take the city. Take what they were owed. Take more than that, honestly, because at this point, why not? In April 1204, the Crusaders broke through the walls of Constantinople and unleashed one of the most infamous sackings in medieval history. For 3 days, the wealthiest, most sophisticated city in the Christian world was stripped bare. Churches lost centuries of gold, silver, and holy relics. Priceless Byzantine art was melted down for scrap or shipped west. Bronze statues that had stood since antiquity were torn down and smelted. The famous bronze horses from Constantinople's hippodrome were hauled off to Venice, where they still sit today, on top of St. Mark's Basilica, a permanent gleaming trophy from a holy war that never reached its target. The Crusaders then carved up the Byzantine Empire and crowned one of their own, Baldwin of Flanders, as ruler of a freshly invented state called the Latin Empire. Venice, as always, took the best ports and the trading rights, turning the entire fiasco into the most profitable business arrangement in its history. Jerusalem was never mentioned again in any serious way. The crusade that set out in 1202 to liberate the Holy Land finished in 1204, having conquered a Christian capital instead, without a single soldier setting foot anywhere near the city they'd sworn to save. Word reached Pope Innocent III, and by every surviving account, he was horrified, firing off furious letters condemning the massacre of fellow Christians and the desecration of their churches. It changed nothing. The Latin Empire stood. The loot stayed looted. Papal outrage tends to arrive a little late for the people who already made off with the silver. The men at the center of it all didn't fare much better than the city they ruined. Enrico Dandolo, the doge who'd first floated the idea of working off a debt by attacking Zara, died in Constantinople the following year, having lived just long enough to watch a shipping dispute turn into an empire. Alexios IV, whose desperate promises had lured the crusade to the city in the first place, was already dead months before the sack he unintentionally triggered. Mort Sufflos, the eyebrow-browed usurper who set off the final assault by refusing to pay, fled the city, was captured, and was executed by being thrown off the top of a column in Rome, a punishment the Latin sources specifically noted was chosen for dramatic effect. The Latin Empire the Crusaders built lasted barely 60 years before Byzantine forces retook their own capital in 1261. But the empire they got back was gutted. The wealth, the art, the institutions built up over centuries had been melted down, shipped off, or destroyed in 3 days. Byzantium spent its remaining 2 centuries as a fraction of what it had been. And when Constantinople finally fell for good in 1453, this time to the Ottomans, historians still trace that final collapse back to the 4 days in 1204 when the city's own allies gutted it first. Nobody set out to sack Constantinople. They set out to reach Jerusalem, hit a bill they couldn't pay, made one reasonable-sounding compromise, then another, until the holiest army in Europe was melting down bronze horses for scrap in the middle of the wrong city entirely. And Jerusalem, through all of it, remained exactly as unliberated as the day the whole thing started.